Well, we'll get started now, I think. Welcome, everyone, to the fourth of our lectures in the series on social protection. We are very pleased to have Lucie Gadenne and Monica Singhal here to teach us a little bit more about cash transfers, which we heard about last week. And this lecture today specifically will focus on the form of transfers, cash, in-kind, voucher, etc. They have a lot of experience in this. And we're very excited to learn from them. Briefly before we hear from them, I just wanted to touch on three housekeeping points. The first is to answer a few questions. Um, there are certificates of completion that will be offered for those that attend this series, and the cutoff for that is 10 out of the 12 lectures. The attendance is taken automatically by Zoom, so no need to let us know if you are or aren't here. The second is that this and past lecture slides and recordings are available on the IGC website. And the third is that anybody that would like to be a live panelist so that your camera is on and you're able to ask live questions at the end during the Q&A, if you could raise your hand, we'll choose 20 to 25 of you to be able to do that. And then we'll disable hands after that, and all questions we ask to be directed to the Q&A box. Great. Over to you, Monica.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm really excited to be part of this lecture series. I'm Monica Singhal. Lucie Gadenne is here also, and we're going to be talking about the form of transfers. We're going to be following the handbook chapter pretty closely. And the format that we're going to use is I'm going to start off and kind of cover the first part of the material while Lucie answers questions in the Q&A. And then we're going to switch. So she's going to cover the second part of the lecture. I'm going to handle questions in the Q&A, and then we'll have time for live Q&A at the end. Unfortunately, I won't be able to stay for that because I have to go and teach. So Lucie will be taking the live Q&A. Okay, so the topic that we're going to be talking about today is an issue that's really important from a policy perspective when thinking about the design of social protection programs, which is what form should transfers to beneficiaries take? And policymakers have a number of choices. It sounds like you learned about cash transfers in a previous lecture. You could also have in-kind transfers, which are typically transfers in the form of a particular good. So think about things like transfers in the form of food, fuel, are common in-kind transfers, or voucher programs, which are typically where beneficiaries are given a voucher that allows them to purchase either a certain quantity or a certain value of a restricted set of goods in the market. And part of the motivation for us for this chapter, and sorry, here we go, is that it sort of seems like there's a little bit of a fundamental disconnect between what standard Econ 101 models would predict that transfer should look like and what we tend to see often in the real world in practice. And so in particular, as we're going to talk about, the most standard basic economics textbook model predicts that from the beneficiary perspective, giving transfers in cash is always at least as good as other forms of transfers like in-kind transfers or voucher programs. But yet when we look around at transfer programs around the world, even though there's been a lot of recent academic and policy interest in unconditional cash transfers, in-kind transfers and vouchers continue to remain the predominant form of social protection programs throughout the world. And one of the other things that's somewhat of a challenge to the standard textbook model is that in a number of studies where you actually survey beneficiaries and ask them what type of transfers would they prefer, beneficiaries themselves often report a preference for in-kind transfers over cash, which again is something that contradicts the standard model. And so this is our sort of starting point, is trying to understand how do we think about this? How do we think about the optimal form of transfers? And there's three main goals from the chapter and from our talk today that we want you to come away with. So the first is to understand the key underlying characteristics that distinguish different forms of social protection programs. And what we mean by that is it might seem really straightforward when you say cash, in kind, voucher, what that is or what the dividing lines are between those form of transfers. But the truth is that they're often used in different ways in the literature and in practice. So, to give an example, if you have a voucher that you give to a beneficiary that's quite flexible in what that voucher can be spent on, that starts to look a lot like a cash transfer. Whereas if you have a voucher that is highly restrictive and can only be used for a very, very limited set of goods, that voucher starts to look a lot more like what we would think of as an in-kind transfer program. And so what we're going to do right at the beginning is just discuss instead what are the key underlying characteristics that differentiate these transfer programs and how are we going to be using these terms in this chapter. The second main goal is to understand the trade-offs across these different types of transfer modalities from both the beneficiary perspective, the individual or house the transfer, and the planner perspective or the policymaker perspective, and where those two things may be in alignment, but where there may be differences or divergences between maybe what the beneficiary would want and what the planner's goals or objectives are. And finally, understand what we know about these trade offs from the empirical evidence, and also importantly, where this evidence currently falls short and where we think that there's room for further studies, further research to enhance our understanding on these topics. So that's where we're going. And as I mentioned, I'm going to start off trying to be really clear about what are the key characteristics of transfer programs that we think differentiate those modalities, and that these characteristics ultimately are going to be what's important rather than whether we label the transfer program as a cash program or an in-kind program or a voucher program. And so in particular, the whole first part of the chapter is going to focus on understanding the following defining characteristics. First, does the transfer place restrictions on beneficiary consumption? And so by that, what we mean is, does the transfer in some way restrict the set of goods that beneficiaries are allowed to consume? And so we typically think of cash transfers, for example, as being unrestricted, whereas vouchers, in-kind transfers typically restrict the set of things that beneficiaries can use those transfers to consume. The second is, does the transfer have nominal value or real value? And what we mean by that is, effectively, is the transfer price indexed? So if prices of goods increase, is the value of the transfer increasing? Is it allowing you to actually purchase the same set of goods? Or is the value of that transfer affected when there's inflation or when prices change? And the third is whether the transfer changes the local supply of the good. So just by virtue of the fact that the government is engaging in this transfer, is that changing the local supply of the transfer that we're thinking about? Okay, so this is kind of how we're delineating these characteristics. Again, this is kind of for the purposes of this chapter. It doesn't mean that every transfer that has that label exactly has to follow this matrix, but let me go through how we're thinking about this. We're defining a cash transfer as a transfer that does not place any restrictions on the beneficiary's consumption. It does not have real value. So we're thinking about a transfer where if you give the beneficiary $100, but all of a sudden there's massive inflation, the effective value of that transfer is eroded. And cash transfers are not going to directly increase local supply of particular commodities. Okay. Now, again, the reason why I'm emphasizing that the characteristics are important is that you could also imagine having a cash transfer that's price indexed, where the actual amount of cash transfer that the beneficiary gets is somehow linked to local prices. And that's why we're kind of defining cash as following these set of characteristics, but not that you couldn't define a type of transfer that doesn't fall exactly into this matrix. Okay. We're going to think about two different types of voucher programs. So a monetary voucher would be, I'm going to give a voucher that's worth $100 and the beneficiary can purchase a certain set of goods with that voucher. So both monetary and quantity vouchers. So a quantity voucher would say this voucher guarantees you a certain quantity of a particular good. So a gallon of milk, a bag of rice. In both of those cases, we're going to think about vouchers as placing restrictions on consumption, that the voucher can only be used for a certain limited set of consumption goods. Quantity and monetary vouchers are going to be distinct from each other in that monetary vouchers, like cash, are going to have nominal value rather than real value. So if there's inflation, if prices rise, the effective value of that voucher decreases, whereas a quantity voucher is going to have real value because it guarantees you a certain quantity of that good no matter what happens to the local price. Okay, and neither monetary nor quantity vouchers are going to directly increase local supply. And finally, we think about in-kind transfers as being a yes on all of these characteristics on our matrix. An in-kind transfer places restrictions on consumption. It has real value because you're transferring the beneficiary a given quantity of a good, no matter what is happening to local prices. And the key differentiating characteristic of in-kind versus vouchers is in-kind transfers are directly bringing increased supply of that good into the local community. And we're going to see in a little bit why that's important. All right. So outline for today, and again, this is very much following the outline of the handbook chapter. We're going to start with the first two characteristics, which are what are the implications of putting restrictions on the consumption bundle? How do we think about real versus nominal transfer value? Those are the topics that I'm going to talk about. Then I'm going to turn it over to Lucie, who's going to talk about what are the implications of changes to local supply and also demand. So that's the third row on our matrix. Finally, we're going to talk about a set of issues that are not directly in the matrix, which is what is actually happening on the ground, and what are some of the things that this matrix might not be capturing in terms of the relevance of how programs are administered and implemented in practice, and why that may matter. And conclude with saying, where do we see some of the open areas of research and what directions do we see things moving in terms of the policy debates on these questions? All right, so let's start with restrictions on the consumption bundle. And my understanding is that there's a variety of kind of backgrounds of the participants here. So for some of you, this may be very, very familiar. You may have seen this before, but I really want to make sure that everybody gets on the same page. So when we talk about the kind of what we call the neoclassical benchmark or the textbook result, this is a standard result that you would learn in Econ 101, which is if you think about what beneficiaries should prefer in our textbook model, they should always weakly prefer cash, or more precisely, an unrestricted transfer to an equal value restricted transfer like an in-kind or voucher program. Okay, why is this? The intuition here is pretty simple. If the beneficiary would have anyway consumed the amount of the restricted good under the cash transfer, she doesn't really care whether she gets the cash transfer or, for example, the in-kind transfer. So an example here would be, suppose that I gave a poor household, $10 worth of rice, and under cash transfer, they were anyway going to spend at least that amount on rice. Then the in-kind transfer isn't actually restricting their choice of consumption. They're still able to consume the amount of rice and the amount of other goods that they wanted to consume. Okay. The economics term for that is that the transfer is inframarginal. It's not affecting the ultimate choices that beneficiaries are able to make. So in that case, the beneficiary doesn't really care. Do you give me cash? Do you give me the in-kind? It's not going to affect my overall consumption decisions. The case where cash is better in the standard textbook model is if you're kind of giving me too much of the restricted good relative to what I would have wanted to consume. Right? So suppose, for example, you're giving me $10 of jelly beans. I might say, well, okay, I like jelly beans. I'm happier to have $10 of jelly beans than nothing. But if you had given me $10 of cash, this is not how I would have chosen to spend my money. I would have rather spent my money on other things. Okay, and so the idea here intuitively is that cash is always going to give the beneficiary more flexibility to allocate their budget in a way that is utility maximizing. And when in-kind transfers don't allow that, we say that the transfer is marginal and the transfer is actually distorting the individual's choice of consumption. You're forcing them to consume too much of the restricted good and therefore less of other goods. And that bundle is actually not what is utility maximizing. So for those that have more of an economics background, if you look at the handbook chapter, we have this in terms of graphs and budget constraints to show you kind of where the utility maximizing point is of the individual and when transfers are going to be marginal versus inframarginal. But hopefully that intuition is clear. Fundamentally, the idea is that if you give individuals cash, they have flexibility. They are able to spend that cash in a utility maximizing way. And so they're always going to prefer that weekly to a case where you're restricting their consumption. And so that's the standard textbook result. And that is kind of the reason that a lot of economists would say, hey, cash is going to be the preferred form of transfer from the beneficiary perspective. Okay, so that idea that transfers, restricted transfers, can distort the consumption bundle is the real core feature that underlies this textbook result. But one question that I think hasn't received a lot of attention in the literature is this actually empirically relevant for real world transfer programs? And so this is where we start to turn to the empirical evidence. And if we look at two of the largest in-kind transfer programs that exist in the world, the Rastra program in Indonesia, the public distribution system in India, which some of you may be familiar with, we find that in practice, rice transfers are actually inframarginal for the vast majority of households. So for 93% of households, in some work that Lucie and I and co-authors did in India, and 97% of households in Indonesia, which is kind of suggesting, hey, maybe we've emphasized this marginality a little bit too much in practice, that in a lot of cases, these real world in kind transfer programs tend to be transferring goods that are staple commodities for households that form a pretty large share of their consumption bundle and that are not often larger than what households would choose to consume on their own. And so that kind of calls into question how important is this distortion of the consumption bundle in practice. Although one caveat that we do want to note is that we're kind of treating rice as rice, but there may also be differences in quality between the rice or the other kinds of commodities that you get through these transfer programs and market goods. So in practice, these may not be completely perfect substitutes, but we still think it's striking for how few households these transfers actually appear to be marginal. So what are some of the other things that we might want to be thinking about when we think about restrictions on the consumption bundle? So this is where we move away from the kind of the neoclassical benchmark and say, well, could there be differences between giving households cash versus in kind in more behavioral models where households are not necessarily always following this fully rational utility maximization process? And what a lot of these behavioral models predict, and what we have empirical evidence and survey evidence in support of, is that even when transfers are inframarginal, so even when they look like, let's say, the PDS or Rastra, and let's ignore quality differences, suppose transfers really are inframarginal, the standard model should say, well, households should behave exactly the same way, whether they get an inframarginal transfer or whether they get cash. And the truth is, that's not what we see, and that's often not how households are thinking about these types of transfers. So, what are some of the places where you might get an asymmetry between cash and in kind, even if the household is those transfers are inframarginal for the household? So the first is we often see flypaper effect. So if households get a grant or a transfer that is of a particular good or is even labeled for a particular good, that transfer often sticks where it hits. That's why we call it flypaper. So if you give me a transfer that's labeled for food, my propensity to consume food is often much higher than it is out of cash. There's other types of biases that people have documented in the literature that people tend to spend cash and in-kind transfers in different ways, even when they're inframarginal. A second thing that this textbook model abstracts from is that beneficiaries may feel differently about receiving cash versus in-kind transfers. And so the organization Give Directly, which has been a real pioneer in the sphere of giving beneficiaries unconditional cash, really emphasizes the idea that when you give households cash, you're showing them more respect, they have more empowerment, they're going to have a greater sense of dignity because you're basically telling the beneficiary, hey, we trust you to know what's best for yourself and what's best for your household in terms of how to use these transfers. And that empowerment effect may be of inherent value. We may like that beneficiaries have more of a sense of dignity, and it may cause them to have more positive feelings towards the government or towards the granting agency. In contrast to that, there's an interesting phenomenon that you see in some of the survey evidence where when beneficiaries are asked, okay, you said that in fact you prefer in-kind transfers to cash, why is that? Some beneficiaries actually say that they're kind of worried that this cash will be dissipated or poorly spent. Whereas if they receive an in-kind transfer or voucher, they actually value that ability to tie their own hands and make sure that their resources are being spent in a certain way versus cash, which might be poorly spent. So that's kind of the opposite idea, is that beneficiaries themselves may not trust themselves with receiving cash or may know that they have some self-control problems in terms of how that cash might be spent. Okay, so these are a variety of models where we might imagine that there are going to be differences between cash and in-kind, separate from whether or not that transfer is marginal or inframarginal, that are going to affect whether a beneficiary would prefer one or the other. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is move to thinking about planner preferences. And so typically, when we think about a planner as maximizing social welfare, we would think about the planner as wanting to do what's best from the beneficiary perspective. And so, again, the most standard kind of textbook model of the planner would be, well, if it's bad for the beneficiary, then it's bad for policy. And so, if we're moving individuals away from the consumption choices that they want to make, that's going to be bad for welfare. And what's interesting, again, in terms of this potential disconnect between theory and practice, is that I think if you ask a lot of policymakers, they would say exactly the opposite, which is that the restriction on the consumption bundle is actually a feature, not a bug. It's something that we like about vouchers or in-kind transfers. We actually want to be restricting the choices of the beneficiary's consumption. So how do we understand that? So one possible difference could be that we think about beneficiaries as doing what is best for them as an individual, whereas we might think about a planner or a policymaker trying to do what's best for society. And so you could, in theory, for example, say, hey, there's a reason we want to encourage households to consume certain types of goods, let's say good healthcare consumption, because it's got positive externalities. You're going to hear, I think, in a later chapter about the potential role of in-kind transfers in improving targeting. I'm not sure that in practice, this is the biggest component of why in-kind transfers are so relevant. I think really it's the second bullet point, is that ultimately we often think that the planner may have different preferences than the beneficiaries. So the planner, sorry, excuse me for 1 second. Some of the things that we often hear in policy debates are, one, this concern that if we give beneficiaries cash, they're going to spend it poorly. And so there's kind of this idea, for example, that I think is longstanding that you'll hear, which is that if you give households cash, they're going to waste it on things like sin goods, like tobacco or alcohol or things like that. And they're not going to spend it on what's best for them or potentially what's best for children in the household who might not be the ones that are making the spending decisions. The second thing that you might hear is that donors or voters may say, well, we care that households have basic necessities, but that doesn't mean that we want to allow them to just spend cash on anything that they want to, even if those things might be utility maximizing for the household. And so the form of transfers may reflect the preferences that voters and donors have about what they're willing to have their money used for. And I think that this second bullet point here, that is probably one of the main reasons that we see in-kind and voucher programs in practice, which is some notion that there's a desire to actually restrict the consumption choices of beneficiaries. And one of the things that we think is an interesting open question in the literature is to what extent these preferences are based on correct versus incorrect assumptions about what beneficiaries would actually do if they were given cash transfers. I think a lot of people in both the academic sphere and the policy side have been quite surprised about some of the rigorous RCT-based evidence that's come out of actually giving households cash that doesn't really seem to support the idea that households waste this type of cash on goods that are not what we would think of as desirable long run investments or appropriate. And so, one of the things that we think is interesting is to what extent, as we develop a greater body of evidence of what households would actually do with cash, which is something that has only relatively recently been tested, whether that may change some of this debate in terms of what kinds of assumptions are underlying these policymaker preferences. All right, the second main distinction when we talk about differences across transfer programs is something that has not received that much attention in the literature, which is real versus nominal transfer value. So in the standard textbook model, we tend to think of a static model. Everything is happening at one period in time, which means that we're kind of ignoring potential changes of the prices of goods that households are consuming. And in reality, and in particular in a lot of LMICs, low and middle income countries, where markets are not very integrated, it turns out there's quite a lot of local price variability. So that when you have local supply and demand shocks, these are often reflected in a lot of volatility in local prices. Okay, and the reason that this is important is that if transfers are not indexed to local prices, so if the amount of cash that you're getting is not actually indexed to local prices, and typically that is not the case. We were not able to find any major cash transfer programs that are price indexed because it's logistically often very challenging to do. That means that cash and in-kind transfers can only be equivalent in expectation. If prices change, the relative values of these transfers are also going to change. And what that means is that when we have this type of price risk, we need to consider not only what we typically think about when we think about transfers, which is the redistribution value. Transfers may also have insurance value, which is to what degree do they protect households against this price variability. Okay, so for those that are interested, this section of the chapter is largely based on a paper that's co-authored with me and Lucie and other collaborators. And for those that have more of an economics background, you can refer back to that original paper where we go through this in a more formal model. Today, I'm just going to give you the basic intuition. So suppose that there's a staple commodity households are consuming, like rice, and prices of rice may go up or down across different states of the world. The intuition is that if households value additional income when the price of rice is high, so that when the price of rice is high, I would really value additional purchasing power, then what I would really like is index transfers that are increasing in the price of rice, so that when the price of rice is high, you give me more money. When the price of rice is low, I'm willing to take less money. In practice, that's often very difficult to do. It's hard to observe and to index transfers to local conditions in real time. So if policymakers are not able to do that, then households may actually value in-kind transfers or quantity vouchers because these implicitly provide insurance because their value increases automatically as the price of rice increases. So the intuition is if I give you $100 and the price of rice increases, the effective value of that transfer for you decreases. Whereas if I've given you $100 worth of rice, then you're protected against that price variability. So again, we go through this more formally. For those that are interested in this topic, you can refer back to the paper, but that's the basic intuition behind the model. And then we turn empirically to looking at the PDS system in India, which is India's largest in-kind transfer program. And what we demonstrate is that expansions in the PDS system, so making the program more generous, not only results in increases in household calories, that's kind of the level effect or the redistribution effect. I give you more money, you're able to purchase more goods. but it also reduces households' sensitivity of calories to local prices. So what we find is that when prices of rice increase, households' consumption decreases, and in fact, they're more likely to fall below minimum calorie guidelines. And when the in-kind transfer program becomes more generous, they exhibit less sensitivity of calories to local prices, which suggests that these in-kind transfers are playing an insurance function in addition to a redistribution function. More broadly, we think that considering insurance value is important and understudied when we're thinking about these trade-offs across different forms of social protection. Okay. Sorry, I do apologize. I'm getting over a cold, as you can probably hear. But I'm going to turn it over to Lucie now. As I said, I'm sorry that I can't stay for the Q&A, but it's been a real pleasure to talk with you this morning. Thanks.
Thanks, Monica. I hope you feel better. Just so you know, there's tons of stuff happening in the chat. So thank you everyone who's, the Q&A, who's sending questions in the Q&A. I've tried to respond as much as possible. Some of those will be easier to tackle once we've covered the whole material. So yeah, Monica, you see what you can do, and I'll go back and I'll try to take stock of where we are once I'm done. Let me share my screen. Yep, I suspect you can all see my screen now. And you can all hear me decently. If not, one of you guys on the panel should unmute yourselves and chat out, and I'll do something about it.
Great. Thanks, Lucie.
Brilliant. Thanks. Great. So taking over from where Monica left it up, I'm not going to talk about how cash versus kind versus voucher transfers behave if they're going to affect a local supply and demand conditions. So, which means really I'm going to talk about how these transfers are going to affect market prices. So first off, why could these transfers affect market prices? Just go back to Econ 101. What changes market prices? Well, changes to supply or changes to demand. If we think about an in-kind transfer, Monica's mentioned this briefly already. What does an in-kind transfer do to an economy? Well, it's transferring some amount of a good X to a local economy, and therefore it increases the supply of that good X, which means it can potentially decrease the price of that good X, right? We're just talking a very standard supply and demand framework here. When we're talking about cash or voucher transfers, these will tend to push demand. So you're basically giving people money, literally for cash, more or less for vouchers. You're going to push demand for all non-inferior goods. And all non-inferior goods are goods that basically, when your income increases, you demand more of them, right? So you're giving people more income. That's going to increase demand for all these non-inferior goods via income effects or income elasticities. And therefore, that's going to increase the prices of potentially all of these goods. So potentially all of the goods in an economy could increase with a cash or voucher transfer. Just to note, these price effects are only going to occur if the transfers are big enough to affect markets, right? So intuitively, if I give more cash to just one person in an economy, how that person changes their behavior is not going to affect the prices of all good in the economy. Similarly, if I give a kilo of rice to just one person in the economy, it's also not going to affect the price of rice, right? So you need these transfers to be large with respect to the market size. So either very big transfers or relatively small markets. And I'll get back to what this could mean. Oh, hang on, why am I? Yeah, it's just a bit of a delay. There we go. So that's the theory of how transfers could affect local market prices. There's now quite a large, at least growing, body of empirical evidence on this question, with quite a few people in recent years who, when looking at the cash or voucher or in-kind transfers, have done their very best to try to estimate effects of these transfers on local market prices. And to the extent that we can start, drawing conclusion, typically there's not much effect of transfers on local prices. For cash, there's now several RCT evidence that test, randomized cash transfer and find no effect on local prices. Similarly, no effect on local prices for vouchers and not for in-kind transfers. And here, this is the paper with Monica that Monica was talking about earlier, where in India, we've looked for whether these in-kind transfers to the public distribution system in India affected local prices, and we can't find any evidence on that. However, in some cases, in some particularly tight contexts, researchers have found some effects of transfers on local prices. And these tend to be in rural, remote areas. And this links back to my earlier point about the size of the transfer relative to the size of the market. If the market is really small and isolated, i.e. supply can't adjust fast to changes in demand and vice versa, you can see in some cases effects of transfers on local prices. So Phil al. In the Philippines context find for in rural areas or poor rural areas of the Philippines, cash transfers do increase local prices somewhat. Al. In Mexico find that in rural remote areas of Mexico, so smaller markets where the cash and the in-kind transfer, in their case, they're comparing cash and in-kind, they're both relatively big compared to the size of the market. They find positive effects of cash transfers on prices, so some local inflation, and some decreases in prices when there's an in-kind transfer. Okay, and so the idea there, yes, as I've said, in those areas, local supply can't adjust fast enough to increases in demand, right? So that's for cash. Cash increases local demand for good. And because they're remote, because they're not very well integrated with other markets, you can't have local supply increases that are just fast enough, so you get some inflation. And for income transfers, well, they may be large relative to local incomes. So what we do, and I just thought I'd mention quickly in the paper with Monica, where we're looking at the PDS transfer in India, we wanted to, think ourselves, why can't we see any kind of effects on local prices of our reasonably large in-kind transfer in India? And we compared our setting to that in Al. In Mexico and their study of an in-kind transfer. And basically, their in-kind transfer is very, very large compared to even this reasonably large in-kind transfer that we study in India. And so the fact that we're not seeing any price effect is just a reflection of our transfer isn't large enough to have plausible price effects that we would be able to detect in the data. Basically, what we find is a small decrease that's not statistically significant. It's too small for us to detect with a statistical significance, but it's not inconsistent with what others have found in terms of statistically significant decreases in price. So it's not unlikely, given this body of evidence, that price effects of cash on kind transfers are the kind of levels that we typically see implemented in low and middle income countries. These price effects will be too small to detect on average by a researcher, but they could matter very much for some populations. So having established this, yes, on average, they may be too small, but they might be non-trivial in some cases. Let's think about what they mean. Why do we even care about this? Why does it matter versus whether cash or in-kind transfers have different effects on local prices? Well, first, and perhaps most obviously, it matters for equity. What I mean by that, it matters for who wins or who loses from these cash or in-kind or voucher transfers. Intuitively, the second you've got a market price that's changing is going to create winners and losers. Some people are going to gain from an increase in price. Some people are going to lose, right? So typically, let's think of a price decrease. Consumers will gain from a price decrease. If they're consuming the good, they get a utility gain from having a lower price. But if you're producing that good and the price falls, then you're going to lose. And that very simple idea was often seen, especially in the earlier literature, as a good motivation for in-kind transfers, a good rationale for in-kind transfers. It was called pecuniary redistribution. Pecuniary redistribution simply means transfers that redistribute across households through their effects on market prices. And the idea in that original Code et al. 1994 paper was thinking, okay, in-kind transfers, by increasing local supply of a good, will decrease the market price of that good. And that was good in their minds because it was redistributing from producers who sell the good to consumers who buy the good. So there, if you see the term pecuniary redistribution in literature, that's all they mean, really. Obviously, this is only welfare increasing if we care about poor households more, and poor households tend to consume the good that's transferred. In practice, however, in low and middle income countries, poor households often produce food items at home. So if you've got an in-kind transfer that by increasing the supply of local food items, decreases the price of these food items. Whether or not poor households gain from this or not depends on whether they're net producers or net consumers of the goods. Right? So if I'm a net consumer of rice and the price of rice decreases, that's good for me. If I'm a net producer of rice and the price of rice decreases because of this in-kind transfer, that's actually bad for me. In general, I just want to flag this idea of pecuniary redistribution via market prices. That's a feature of any policy that affects market prices, not just in-kind transfers versus cash transfers. And there's very well-established and ancient literature, starting with Bestie and Camper, discussing this in the low and middle income country setting. And there is one case, so that Filmer et al. Paper in the Philippines that I was mentioning in the previous slide, where actually, so here recall that they find that they're looking at a cash transfer, and they find that in rural, remote areas in the Philippines, it increases local prices. And they say that, and they show that these effects on local prices actually leads to negative effects on nutrition for some non-beneficiary children. So in the chat, someone was asking about spillovers earlier. This is an example of a spillover, right? So they're looking at the cash transfer, and they're looking at the effect on children in households that don't get the transfer, and they're finding negative effects of the cash transfer because they argue the cash transfers increase local prices on food, which means the non-beneficiaries can afford less food from a given amount of income. And then, so that's how changes in local prices affect the redistributive properties of different kinds of transfers. There's also, efficiency effects of local price changes. And then to think about those, we have to move beyond Econ 101. So I'm going to introduce this today, and I'm happy to take questions later if there are some, because this is getting to a slightly more sophisticated model that I'm not going to describe in details. But very simply, if we start thinking that the private markets in low and middle income countries aren't perfectly competitive, then there might be an efficiency rationale for different kinds of transfers. What I mean by this, think of a market where there's limited competition, right? So there's some retailers, but there's not much competition between retailers. That means that the local retailers or suppliers may strategically ration their supply of some good to keep the prices inefficiently high, right? If you've seen a basic model of a monopoly, that's kind of the idea, right? Is that if there's not tons of competition, suppliers will tend to produce and sell not enough of a good to try to keep the prices high, which means their marginal cost will be less than the price, so they get bigger markets, right? So they make more money. From a social efficiency perspective, that's not good, right? We have undersupply of the good and too high prices compared to what's efficient. And now, if we think that's the context we're in, then it's possible that in-kind transfers may actually bring markets closer to the efficient competitive level. While limited competition leads to undersupply of some of the good, right? An in-kind transfer could come in and increase the supply of that good, thereby bringing the supply up and the prices down closer to the competitive level. That's an argument in favor of in-kind transfers over cash transfers or voucher, which again has been made theoretically quite a long time ago. This is another Steve Coate paper in the late 80s. I should flag this is mostly a theoretical argument, right? So you could write it down with models of limited competition. However, what we flag in the handbook chapter is that if you look at what's been happening in labor markets, the recent evidence on if you will, in-kind transfers in labor markets, the evidence is in line with this theory. So here we can think about employment programs, which are basically programs that give people jobs in local labor markets. So the famous one is the NREGA program in India, but it's not the only one. And there people have shown that by increasing the amount of jobs available in the economy, they increase efficiency of labor markets if they're imperfectly competitive. So if labor markets are imperfectly competitive, i.e. there's not enough jobs in the economy in the first place, these employment programs can increase efficiency. As far as we can tell, there's not clear-cut evidence that the same is true in food markets, i.e. in-kind transfers of food could also increase efficiency of local food markets. But there's some reasons to believe this story may be at play. First of all, there's some evidence that retail market competition is fairly limited in low and middle income countries. So In theory, it's possible that retailers are undersupplying, keeping prices too high compared to what's efficient. Then in that Cunha et al. Paper that looks at in-kind versus cash transfers in Mexico that I've already mentioned, they find that the price effects of in-kind transfers, so the fact that in-kind transfers decrease local prices, these seem to be stronger in areas with less competition in retail markets. That's the idea. That's in line with this idea that in-kind transfers could increase competition, could increase efficiency in areas with limited competition. And then there's the Jimenez and Anderson Serra, and I'm sorry why there's no, I don't know why. This is a very recent paper. I don't know why I don't have the date in there. It's also in Mexico. They're also looking at an in-kind transfer, in this case of milk. And they find that as the in-kind transfer of milk is rolled out to different parts of Mexico, it tends to decrease the price of milk in private stores. So again, an effect on private prices in private markets. And their arguments, they have some evidence that suggests that this might be because of market power, i.e. because there's limited competition in the milk market in Mexico, which leads to the markets having inefficiently low levels of trade, and therefore in-kind transfers could be making these markets more efficient. So I hope all this was reasonably simple or straightforward so far. In practice, it may be even more complicated than this. So far, I've talked of a scenario in which, we've got, for example, in the Mexico case, an in-kind transfer of milk, and it's the same milk being transferred to the in-kind transfer as the one that's sold in the private markets. But in practice, and if you've worked with in-kind and cash transfer, in-kind transfer, in the past, you will have thought about this already. The kind of goods that are transferred by in-kind transfer, so the type of milk here, may not be a good substitute for the private good, right? So if you think of India and the in-kind transfer of rice over there, there's a lot of stories that rice may not be as good of quality as the rice that's sold in private market. If that's the case, it makes price effects of in-kind transfers pretty hard to predict. There's actually one paper which we thought was interesting to include because it goes in a fairly counterintuitive direction that actually finds the opposite effect. So this is in Chile, this paper by Tal et al., a recent AAR. They look at the effects of public pharmacies entering a local market. So think of public pharmacies as a kind of an in-kind transfer of medication, right? So it's kind of offering a public option for medication. And what they find is that they actually increase the price of medication in private pharmacies. So this is a kind where an in-kind transfer actually increases private prices. And their story is a quality substitution one. They basically argue these public pharmacies, so this in-kind transfer, if you want, actually provides low quality medication, which means that when the private sector, the private pharmacies sees these public entrants in the markets, they say, okay, these guys are providing the low quality goods. We're going to specialize in the higher quality goods, the high quality medication, which is going to enable us to charge even higher prices. Okay? So this is just to flag that the interaction between an in-kind transfer and private markets is fairly complicated. It can lead to price effects that are of different size. And one important aspect of this story is that we also need to think about how in-kind transfers affect the entry and exit of the private suppliers. Okay, in parts of India, you've got some private retailers that also sell public distribution system goods, i.e. they're also in charge of delivering the in-kind transfer, right? That may mean that when there's more in-kind transfer, more private retailers are about to survive because they make part of their money through delivering the in-kind transfer, and therefore that could increase private competition. So in this context, maybe the in-kind transfer actually increases competition in private markets, private retail markets, which would be good. However, there are other contexts. This is a Busto and Cagliani paper on the Dominican Republic, where actually what they see is that vouchers, in this case it's a voucher transfer, have been designed so that they can only be redeemed, i.e. be used in some private retailers, right? Which de facto decreases private competition by giving some private retailers a big advantage because people can redeem their vouchers there, whilst others, people can't redeem their vouchers there, and therefore they're going to lose market shares, right? So how the existence of an in-kind transfer affects the structure of competition in private markets is inherently very complicated, and it depends on a lot of institutional details. but it could matter for how beneficiaries are affected by the transfers. So I've already started saying, well, it's going to depend on the context and on the details a lot. So that moves me to the last big point that Monica and I wanted to make in that chapter and in this course today, which is we need to think about details of the administration and implementation when we start. A lot of you in the chat were asking, okay, but then what does it mean? Is cash better than in kind or vouchers better than in kind? Well, the answer to this question is going to depend quite a lot on how it's administered and implemented. And luckily, we've had a series of very nice recent papers that could help us put a bit of structure on what aspects of the context matter. So as Monica kind of flashed out earlier, there's a simple neoclassical conceptual framework that gives us a way to think about in-kind versus cash in particular. But considerations outside of this may matter substantially for beneficiary and experience. In particular, political economy or administration issues mean that in practice, government implementation of cash or in-kind or voucher transfers is very far from perfect. And how far from perfect they are matters for the beneficiary experience. So I'm going to do a quick review of recent work that sheds some lights on these issues. I'm going to flag, sometimes it's hard to generalize because these findings can be quite context specific, but I think we learned quite a little bit on which kind of transfer administration details matter for beneficiary experience. So one thing where, this recent literature, which typically is based on randomized control trial, has done a really great job at, moving what we know forward, is thinking about the social costs of provision. What we mean by the social cost of provision is simply what is the cost to society as a whole of providing one unit of utility to beneficiaries via either in-kind transfers, cash transfers, or voucher transfers. Typically, the argument there is in favor of cash or vouchers because it's probably cheaper to give people money or vouchers, which can be a piece of paper or just a barcode on their phone, than delivering food to them because food needs to be carried around, especially if corruption is a concern. That argument, I would argue, 10, 20 years ago, was a little bit caveated by the fact that delivering money to many households in low and middle income countries was pretty complicated even 20 years ago because many of them were unbanked. It's less true now, right? With digitalization of payments moving fast, it's getting easier to transfer money to households in most developing countries. There were questions about this in the chat. I'm happy to return later if helpful. What's happened in practice in recent years is quite a few experiments with policymakers that enable the research teams that are working on the experiments to get very good detailed evidence on the total costs of providing either cash or in-kind or vouchers in a particular context, which enables them to really compare the social cost of provisions in one context. And they find quite, nuanced finding. So a nice paper is by Margulis and Hardiners that consider 4 different cash versus kind, different types of RCTs, randomized controlled trials, and they try to compare the social cost of provisions there. They find, as you'd expect, cash is typically cheaper, but it can be twice as cheap or 4 times as cheap to deliver cash compared to in-kind, depending on the context. So it's quite a wide range of relative advantage of cash in terms of social provision relative to in-kind. And we also know that there are some in-kind transfers, particularly in this case, ones that have been around for a very long time, that are considered extremely cost-effective. So that's the case of the Rastra in-kind transfer program in Indonesia, where the administrative costs are only 4% of the total cost, which by any standard makes it a very effective, cost-effective program. But when you're thinking about the social cost of provisions, it's not necessarily enough to think about, okay, what's the cost to society of providing one unit of utility with cash versus in-kind? You can't just look at the cost to the government in terms of, and what I mean by that, the budget cost, right? The budget costs are obviously very important. That's how much it costs to the government, but that's not the only aspect of the cost to society. One thing to mention, even though there isn't much evidence on this, we have to say, in-kind transfers, unlike cash or voucher transfers, often are implemented together with interventions on the supply side of the market, so producer subsidies, right? So typically in India, there's in-kind transfers of rice, and at the same time, there's subsidies to producers of rice. If we think these belong to the same in-kind transfer policy package, we also need to think about the costs of that as part of the total cost. And there is honestly not very good evidence on how to think about those. Some point on which there is more evidence, and Monica mentioned this briefly already at the start, is, the benefits to the household may be pretty different from the cost to the government. So typically, when we're looking at an in-kind transfer and we want to know how much people benefit from, say, a transfer of a kilo of rice, we think, well, the benefit from a kilo of rice is the cost to the government of paying this kilo of rice. But as we've talked about earlier, in practice, households seem to really like in-cash transfers. And in one case, this is a Shapiro 2019 paper in Kenya, where he essentially tried to elucidate how much people prefer the potential in-kind transfer to a potential cash transfer of the same monetary value. And the answer is a lot more. People tend to value in-kind transfers, in this case, a lot more than just their monetary value. Why? Well, possibly because, the in-kind transfer in this case is basically offering them some kind of agricultural inputs or agricultural extension services or agricultural assets, which may be relatively cheap for the government to buy and to then give to these households. But these households themselves may really struggle to buy it themselves at a cheap price because of economies of scale, right? On a single household on its own is going to struggle to get agricultural extension services to come to its villages, or missing markets, may just not be able to find some kinds of agricultural inputs. So in practice, how much the government pays on an in-kind transfer may be quite a lot less than the benefit to the household of getting the in-kind transfer, which might also be part of why households are declaring a preference for in-kind with respect to cash. So all this to say, it's great to have a good understanding of the budgetary costs of different in-kind versus cash options. And it's a great part of the comparison, but it may miss part of the picture. Someone in the chat earlier was saying, well, I can't remember the context, I'm sorry. We only have cash. It would be great to ask people if they prefer in-kind. I agree. I think surveying beneficiaries on what they prefer and trying to elicit their preferences is a good complement to understanding the budgetary costs. Another kind of administration and implementation question, which in practice is really important, but is typically not that much discussed in the standard theoretical framework, is targeting. In practice, governments care a lot about minimizing both inclusion and exclusion error. Inclusion error is giving a benefit, a transfer to someone when you don't think they should have it, typically because you don't think they're poor. Exclusion error is the opposite, is not giving a transfer to someone when you think they should have it, typically not giving a transfer to someone who's considered poor. In theory, it's not obvious that in-kind versus cash versus vouchers would really make a big difference to targeting questions. But in practice, the few cases that have actually looked at the quality of targeting in an in-kind transfer versus, in this case, a voucher, have found pretty big differences. So this context is a recent paper by Banerjee et al. In Indonesia, where they're comparing a status quo policy, which is the delivering of this large in-kind transfer, Rastra in Indonesia, and an alternative that's being randomized in certain parts of Indonesia, which is replacing it with the vouchers. And they set up the paper so they can test all these differences that the standard model predicts between in-kind and voucher transfers. And they find some small differences in line with standard model, but these are really not very important from a total welfare perspective. What they find that really matters in terms of how these two things, the kind and the voucher transfer, work, is big differences in targeting. In theory, the in-kind and the voucher transfers are giving the same to all poor people in Indonesia on average. In practice, what they find is that under the voucher system, intended beneficiaries, i.e. the poor, are a lot more likely to actually receive the transfer than with the in-kind transfer. In part because the in-kind transfers, the way it happens in practice is they're shared locally by many. So they're supposed to go to only poor households in the village, but in practice, they're being shared by poor and less poor households in the village. This suggests that, there may be a targeting advantage to a voucher system in their case because the technology used basically ensures that only the intended beneficiary gets the voucher. I can't remember in this case if it's on their phone or some other way, but the vouchers can be nominative, can be only given to an intended beneficiary, and that's a lot harder for in-kind transfers. That's potentially good and don't want to spend too much time on that, right? So if you've got technology that enables you to target your cash or your voucher precisely to the households that you want to get the transfer, that's an advantage for cash or vouchers compared to in-kind transfers. It's good as long as you think the government knows what it's doing in terms of targeting, right? It has the right targeting rules and it knows which households are really poor in a community. It may be that the community itself may have some information on who is really poor and who really needs a transfer, in which case, letting the communities decide who receives a transfer via an in-kind transfer may not necessarily be a good idea. But I'm happy to return to the limited evidence there is on this. And then finally, yeah, I'm just checking this is indeed my penultimate slide. The one last thing where we're starting to get a little bit of evidence, but I'm going to flag this as one of these increasingly open questions. In terms of the administration of these in-kind versus cash transfers, an important thing, if you're thinking of implementation and practice of in-kind transfers, is how is competition between the in-kind providers organized, right? So think of a system like India's ration shop system. People can go get their in-kind transfer of rice in one shop, potentially in two shops, potentially in three shops. How much competition is there between the kind of providers of the in-kind transfers themselves? There is evidence from rich countries and healthcare, which is very much a big topic of conversation, that argues that, you know, having competition between public providers of healthcare is good for the beneficiary experience, because getting hospitals to compete with each other forces them to give better treatment to individuals. The logic of this, competition is better for users, even in the public sector. The logic of it, the theory, extends to food transfers in low and middle income countries. There's no reasons not to think this is relevant here. And indeed, there is starting to be a bit of evidence, somewhat indirect, on this topic. In another Banerjee et al. Paper on transfers in Indonesia, what they do is they experimentally increase, this is getting technical, but the number of suppliers that can be involved in the delivery of the in-kind transfers of rice. So basically, how many local agents can distribute the transfers of rice to the very last mile to the households themselves. They find that if you have more of them competing to do this, the price of doing it, the cost of doing it decreases, and the price that the households have to pay to get their in-kind transfer also decreases. So good news all around. Busso and Galani in this Dominican Republic paper I briefly mentioned earlier also experimentally increase the number of retailers where households can redeem their vouchers. So in this case, it's not an in-kind transfer, it's a vouchers. So what they do is they randomly increase how many supermarkets you can go to get your vouchers. And they find that this tends to lower the price at which people can buy things with their vouchers and increases the quality of the goods that they get. So good pieces of evidence that suggests that competition between in-kind providers may be a good thing. But in practice, the devil's in the detail of how you actually organize competition between in-kind providers. And I may return to this if we had time, probably not. I'll just conclude with a few open questions and really starting back to something Monica mentioned at the beginning, which to us was kind of a puzzle, you know, why in practice, when you ask beneficiaries, they seem to really agree that they like in-kind transfer more than cash transfers, even for an equivalent monetary amount. We hope we've given you some elements of why this could be the case, but to be clear, we don't think we can have a full answer yet, right? So there's still loads of work to be done there, and I know some of you in the Zoom room are PhD students, and I would encourage you to think about this. I've talked about a bit about the general equilibrium price effect. I think we're starting to know that these can matter, but where exactly they can matter and why is a great and I think still open for a question. There's also, I have to mention the possibility that the in-kind transfers, by increasing the local supply of some goods in a market, could affect not just the level of market prices, so decrease market prices, but could also affect the variation. So price risk that Monica and I and co-authors have studied in one of our papers, it's possible that a large in-kind transfer could make price risk change, potentially decrease price risk in private markets. But that's a very open question and speculation. As I've mentioned before, the effects of transfers on private markets, how they affect competition, how they affect entry and exit of private suppliers are very poorly known and could really matter again from the beneficiary perspective. And then finally, I saw in the chat quickly, there were quite a few questions. Okay, so what is the optimal form of transfer? Should people do cash or should people do in kind? How does this vary with context? And I think really one key takeaway, if you want, is it probably varies with the level of development. So very poor countries or countries with different kinds of economic structure, the optimal type of transfer may be very different from a, say, middle income country with more urbanized economy and things like this. But I don't think we have a systematic framework to think about this more generally. And I think, thinking about this in a more structural way may be very promising. Just as an example, so Monica and I, in our paper with Sandeep and Sam, have shown that, there is insurance value from in-kind transfers. And that's relevant in context with a lot of price risk, a lot of price fluctuation, and poorly integrated markets. That's probably quite relevant in poorer low and middle income countries. As they develop and integrate markets, it might be that price risk falls and that insurance aspect of in-kind transfers becomes less important. And therefore, the comparison between cash and in-kind changes. So I think I'll just end by saying, there's been really nice work over the last decade or so thinking about, let's not just talk about low and middle income countries as a group, but optimal policy type is probably pretty different for low income countries versus upper middle income countries. We've starting to have, good ways to think about this for labor, for optimal tax policy. I think we're at the start of thinking about this for the optimal form of transfer. And I would urge those of you interested in research to think about this more thoroughly. I'm going to end here. We still have a good 20 minutes for questions. Monica, you've actually raised your hand, so I'll take it.
Yeah, sorry. So I just wanted to say again, I'm going to have to take off. I tried my best to kind of answer questions in the chat. You'll see that there's some that I didn't get to, but I'll just highlight to kick off the discussion and then take off to leave you with the questions. Some of the things that a number of people brought up were this idea of kind of black market in resale of in-kind goods and vouchers, and both what that means for whether we're giving beneficiaries kind of what they want, but also what that means for the efficacy of transfers and, prices and quantities in the market if you have this sort of black market going on in parallel. And the second thing that came up a lot was this idea about the kind of supply side social cost, the role of corruption, how we think about that, and also how that may be changing with the kind of more digital landscape and technological innovations. And finally, as you echoed, a question that came up a lot is like, well, what should we do? What kind of transfer is the best? And I think that you kind of addressed that a little bit towards the end, but I think that was kind of another theme of like, all right, so tell me what's the right answer? And, I think the conclusion is sort of this is more of a way of thinking about what are the factors that you want to be thinking about, and the right answer may be context specific. But I'm going to leave it there, and I'm sorry I have to take off, but it's been a pleasure chatting with all of you today. Thanks, Lucie.
Thanks, Monica.
Okay, bye.
Okay, what I might do is those of you guys who are panelists, because it might be, and you may have been looking at the Q&A more than me, which I literally haven't been unable to look at it for the past half hour. If you guys have pressing questions or want to summarize something in the Q&A, please go ahead. I'm happy to take a few like live questions, and then I can take Monica's questions and see if I could do something about the Q&A. Give you a few minutes to see if you want to volunteer as I'm looking through the Q&A. How do we raise our hand when an icon is not there? Well, so those of you, just to say, so those of you who were named panelists at the start can. Okay, now I'm seeing hands being raised, but so those of you who are not panelists can't. Sorry, so you'll have to write it in the chat. Okay, so now I have a lot. So I'm going to take them in the order in which I've seen them on my screen. So Amit, do you want to unmute yourself to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation and for sharing the insights. This is super helpful and very relevant for the work that I personally do here in India. My question is a more, is a general one, and it pertains to, the engagement with the key decision makers, including policy makers, the planners that you referred to, and even the political, decision makers, when it comes to the design of social protection systems, and that would include, the choice of modality, targeting and all those, specific elements that you talked about. In my experience, I've seen that these programs are, most of the cases are designed, without taking into account the evidence that is there. Majority of them are, driven by the politics of the time, and even if there's evidence that a program is not working, is less than optimal when it comes to delivering the intended impact, there is a very strong level of hesitation of changing the nature of the program. So withdrawing, let's say, a specific type of benefit, or changing from in kind to cash, or cash to other modalities, depending upon the evidence. Decision makers usually avoid doing that for fear of political backlash. So how do you in your experience and working in multiple countries, engaging with policymakers, as well as field operatives, what is the best way, in your opinion, to engage with decision makers, so that this evidence can be used to impact the design of the program, so that they are kind of delivered more effectively? Thank you.
Thanks, Amit. I'm going to take as many questions as I can, and then I'll try to answer them all together, whilst also keeping an eye on the Q&A. So I'll take the other questions. If you can try to make it concise, I'll just go to Lakshmi. Second on my screen.
Thank you. I just wanted to tie back my question to what you ended with, which was some of the external factors that drive the choice of modality. Are there any studies that suggest any kind of correlation in terms of type of beneficiary, or let me put it as beneficiary characteristics and preference for modality? Example, rural versus urban, potentially level of employment, full, part-time, unemployed, or things like that, or just plain income level, right? I mean, poor is just not poor, so yeah.
Very quickly, because it's easy, and I'm ashamed to say I don't know. So I don't think there's anything striking in the literature, because we would have picked up, but we did not look at this literature with a specific question in mind. So there might be something, but there's nothing. And talking to some of the people who've done these surveys, they didn't tell me anything, but I would encourage you to go through the references in our chapter. There might be a little something. So sorry, great question. I don't know. But I can answer fast as a consequence. Then I've got, I don't know how to pronounce your name, so my apologies. Saee, say?
It's Sai, yeah.
Cool.
Thank you so
Please.
much for the session. I just had a quick question. So with the advent of AI now, what do you think about hyper-personalized transfers? This is a very general question, I know, but do we undermine the solidarity that targeting stands for? And how do you think about this?
Okay, I'll do my best. I'll take Kofororala, probably again mispronouncing. My apologies.
So my question is about my country where there's a very weak monitoring system. We saw the COVID relief materials, in-kind relief materials sent during the COVID pandemic period. Found a lot of them were being ordered across warehouses across the country, and being resold in markets, being distributed to kings and families by the people that were supposed to distribute it to the poor, as you generally put that. So how do we design policies to factor in all of these problems in countries where corruption, like was in the last few slides that you put up, where corruption is very rampant, and there's a possibility of redirection of relief materials and things like this. So that's my question.
Great, thanks. Definitely come back to this. Pranay?
Yeah. Guys, can I share my screen if I could show one just example so that you could relate to my question?
I don't know if I can make you that, and also we need to
Okay.
be
I'm
realistically
afraid that
brief.
won't be
So
possible, but if you could just
Yeah.
succinctly
So
summarize it, that would be
so
great.
we have designed a simulation which assesses the vulnerability at a household level. So over there through the simulation, we can see what is the impact of a scheme on that household. So my question is, at which scale designing a transfer is going to be most effective? Because social protection we cannot design at a household level. So is it like, should we think of a region or how big it is? So which is the most effective scale to design a social protection? It goes to close to the Sai who said ki in the advent of AI, how we could think of individual levels. So yeah, what is the most effective scale to design a scheme?
Thanks. I'll think about that one. And I'm going to take one more because otherwise I'm going to run out of time. So I'll take Darshanas. I'm still going by the order on my screen. Darshanas, do you want to unmute yourself? Okay, then I'm gonna go, and no, it doesn't look like it's my screen. That was one. Oh, there you go. You've unmuted.
All right, really sorry. But
That's good.
it's a continuation of all the questions I've heard so far. So why can't we change the perspective from an individual to a group then? Because wouldn't the promotion of SHGs like self-help groups or cooperatives then be more beneficial? Because cash transfers to a cooperative would then, have more productive would be more productive in a sense. Wouldn't cash transfers would then be invested into productive activities, and then the profit would then be reinvested into the same productive activity. So could can that be considered in such a case?
Okay, thank you. Sorry for the answers I'm not taking, but there's already quite a lot, and I'm trying to get some from the Q&A. So clearly, there's quite a lot of questions on black market, resale, corruption, all of this, and I get that. I want to make a very important distinction first. I'm going to feel differently, and I'm going to argue you should feel very differently as well. Whether we're talking about beneficiaries get their in-kind transfer and then they resell it on a black market or on an open market, I don't care. To me, that's a very different story from, well, the people who are supposed to deliver the transfers to poor households are reselling it on the black market. Why is this very different? Well, in the first case, the beneficiary households are getting their transfer. It's just that instead of eating the rice that they're given, they've decided to sell the rice on the black market. That is still a transfer for these guys. It's just that the existence of a black market or secondary market, whatever you want to call it, is giving them more choice. It actually ends up meaning that the in-kind, when you've got perfect frictionless resale, an in-kind transfer is the same thing as a cash transfer in the most standard neoclassical model that Monica briefly discussed, right? In that scenario, cash and in-kind are the same. That's assuming no price fluctuation, no general equilibrium effect, anything. But even with price fluctuation or general equilibrium effect, it's not obvious to me that from a welfare perspective, it really matters if poor people are getting the in-kind transfer, but they're reselling it on the black market. That we should be, I think, from a welfare perspective, completely relaxed with. It just gives more people more choice. But I think a lot of the questions are more about corruption. So this is the idea that, somehow the government has decided to give a certain amount of money or rice to households, and it has to get to the households, it has to go through different layers of agents. And on every layer of bureaucracy, some of it is disappearing because of corruption. And so then the question, do we have clear evidence that some kind of transfer modality is better in a corrupt environment? The answer is no. We don't have great evidence that points to either direction. What I can say is, in theory, cash or vouchers are better under digital systems where you can get, in theory, the government should be able to press on a button and say, hey, Mrs. X in that village is getting that amount of dollars or that voucher on her phone. And there's no need to go for a bunch of intermediaries, right? So in theory, digitalization of payments could make it a lot easier to transfer cash or vouchers without having all these corruption problems. But that assumes you've got this perfect digital system that enables you to do this. But it's true that, if you're going to deliver rice to Mrs. X in her village, it's harder to do this via your phone pretty much by definition. You're still going to have to rely on different agents to bring the rice. So in theory, digital payments and everything could make it easier to implement these transfers with less corruption, particularly for cash or vouchers. In practice, all these questions make me think of a nice paper which we reference in the handbook chapter, but I didn't have time in the lecture today. Kartik Muralidharan and co-authors, one of their many papers looking at randomized controlled trial of government programs in India. Here they're looking at an electronic version of India's in-kind system, the public distribution system, where I'm not going to get into details, but basically the system now ensures that it's possible to track digitally which households are supposed to get their in-kind transfers and whether or not they get it, which should mean there's a lot less corruption because it's a lot less easy for intermediary to just get some rice into a van and resell it on the black market, because that would be detected by the digital system of transaction. What they find is the introduction of that system does seem to decrease corruption, which they call leakages, but that's roughly what you guys mean by corruption. But it also leads to a lot more exclusion errors, i.e. the people who are unable to interact with the digital system because they may not have a digital ID, for example, which is a big thing, big change that's happened in India, get excluded from the new system. And because these people tend to be very poor, this actually means that the new system, whilst corruption may decrease, does a pretty bad job at getting to the very poorest of the poor. And that's a story that I think is not uncommon if you think about it. Any system that's going to be good at catching corruption may also lead to more mistakes happening. And what you've got to worry about is, are these mistakes going to be excluding the very poor, or are they going to be something else? Because I would argue that you care a lot more about excluding the very poor. So that's one, word of warning on digital technologies and their potential to decrease corruption. But I'm afraid I do not have, and I don't think anyone has, a great answer on, hey, this form of transfer is definitely best if you've got corruption. It's going to depend a lot on the type of corruption. So then moving on, so I hope that kind of answers the corruption black market questions. Amit, you had a great question, which I'm going to argue is not just about the cash versus voucher versus in-kind transfers, but engagement with policymakers. How do we ensure policymakers make decisions that are a bit more evidence-driven? Well, I would argue that what IGC BREAD is doing with this social protection course is part of that, right? It's trying to make sure evidence from research is getting to the widest audience possible. So kudos for all of you guys who are invested in policies and are taking this course. I understand your frustration when you were saying, well, policymakers, you can show them a lot of evidence that a different kind of transfer would be better. They're very status quo biased and they don't want to change things. I agree. In my experience, the moment where it's best to intervene with policymakers is when they're considering change anyways, new administrations or things like this. So they are open to changing the status quo. Typically, they know what they want to change it with, right? But at that moment, you can come in either with evidence to try to change their mind or make them think about things differently, or suggest a randomized control trial, right? To actually say, if you're willing to change status quo, let's try different versions to see what works best. I think this is where the most success has been made in terms of, evidence-driven policies, is when researcher teams were able to get in early enough at the policy reform process. Lakshmi, I've answered, not very satisfactory, but I'm sorry. So we had these questions on, so honestly, I'm not sure I know what you mean on AI and hyper-personalized transfers, which I think was linked to the scale question, which I'm not sure I completely understand either, and the group versus individual question. Just generally on AI, it's not obvious to me. I know everyone wants to talk about AI all the time. It's not completely obvious to me how AI would change these differences between cash versus versus vouchers. It's possible that we can use a mixture of AI and big data to do a better job at predicting who's likely to be poor. All right, but that's a different question. That's a targeting question. That doesn't mean, political type of transfer would be better. I guess by hyper-personalized transfer, you think of a world where AI is able to tell us what kind of goods would be better for household X versus household Y. I have no reason to believe in such a world. I don't see why AI would help with this. And I'm also not convinced it's for the government to necessarily try to decide this with AI. So the scale question, not sure I completely understood. Of course, you can't design a transfer program at the household level, but so you're asking, should we do this in the village or the state or the region or the national government level? one consideration that comes to mind is if you're interested in the general equilibrium effects, it's good to think about, are you going to affect a full local market or not, right? If your transfer is at a very small scale, it's unlikely to have general equilibrium effects. So if you're interested, if you think general equilibrium effects via prices are important, then your transfer needs to be at a large scale. Which leads me to also to the group versus individual transfer question. That's a great question. I kind of think it's more relevant for like the graduation program asset transfers question, because as you said, a big argument there is if you pool a group together and you give them large transfers as a kind of one-off, they're more likely, because of economies of scale, because of coordination problem, they're more likely to, as a group, be able to invest them into something productive than as an individual. I think that's plausible, and I think there's some evidence of that. But to me, that's more related to graduation program questions, because these are one-off transfers. When we think of in-kind versus cash transfers, we mostly think of transfers that are regular, happen pretty much every month, that are there to help poor households maintain a certain level of consumption. This being said, this made me think as well of these questions about targeting, and it's linked to that last paper I was discussing on Indonesia by Banerjee et al. And they're finding that in-kind transfers were distributed more locally. They weren't just going to the very poor that they were supposed to go to, but some people that were not considered poor by the government were getting them as well. That, if you're the government, you can think that's bad, but there may be an advantage to little groups, villages, be involved in the decision of who gets a transfer. And so therefore, if you do the transfer at the group level, not the individual level, by definition, it's going to be the group that decides who gets it and how it's shared. That may be good if we think the group has some really good knowledge on people's incomes level and people's vulnerability, because it's not just, how much income you can make today. It's also, are you likely to lose your job tomorrow? What's your income potential, right? Two households with the same level of income may be thought of very differently by a village community. If one of them is headed by a widow that's old and that has no means of, doing productive investment and becoming rich in the future, versus a young couple that can work, that's starting out in life and that's likely to have better outcomes tomorrow, right? So local groups may be better able to differentiate between these types of scenarios than the government, and that might be a reason to target at the group versus the individual level. The obvious flip side of that is that if you transfer at the level of the group versus individual, you also run the risk that power dynamics within the group mean that some individuals get most of the money just because they're more powerful, just because they're more, bigger decision makers. And, you've mentioned, I think, the women group, and there's a reason why, policymakers and NGOs like doing this with groups with women only, because we tend to know that if there are groups of mixed gender, the men tend to take more of the decisions of how to spend the money, and we may not like this. So people feel more comfortable doing this with groups that are one gender only for that reason. That's a very sweeping attempt to answer your questions as best I can. I am running out of time, so I think all I'm going to say is thanks for taking the time. I hope you've learned something. This was very fast, and I know there's been tons of questions, some of which great, some of which I haven't answered. So all I can say is some of them may be answered by other lecture topics in this series, and do feel free to reach out and reference the papers in our handbook chapter if you've got more questions. But yeah, thank you, everyone. And I should say IGC and BREAD for organizing.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Lucie. And just to note that next week we'll have a lecture on measuring the long run impact of cash transfers. And the week following that, I believe it's specifically on digital influence in cash transfers, which relates to a lot of the questions that have been asked today. But this concludes our lecture today. Big thanks to Monica and Lucie, and to all of you for your engagement and your questions. So we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, Caleb. Thanks all. Have a great end of day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.